Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question which I'm going to answer for you guys today. He basically wants to know, because he hears these four terms thrown around, he doesn't fully understand the difference between catabolism and atrophy, anabolism and hypertrophy. These are all scientific terms that have to do with tissues, so let me put on my +5 cap of weaponsmithing, do a little crafting for you guys, and let's discuss these scientific terms and the difference between them. Now, the cliff notes, for people who don't understand the difference, we're talking about chronic versus acute effect. Atrophy and hypertrophy are chronic. They're long-term measurable effects. Catabolism and anabolism are acute. So, for people who don't understand what all of that means, let's kind of break that down. Let's explain the difference between these things. What people need to understand is that the human body is metabolically active. Everything in your body is undergoing metabolic processes. Every single cell in your body, every second of every day. You are actually gaining and losing muscle and gaining and losing fat in every single fat and muscle cell in your body, literally every second, 24 hours a day, from the time you're born till the time you die. They're happening simultaneously. And that creates some confusion for a lot of people, and that really makes these things complicated because people tend to think in terms of shrinkage and growth. Things get bigger, they get smaller, they stay the same. But that's because you're only looking at the chronic effects, the long-term effects. Now, when we're talking about these terms, some people, again, here tend to think of these as just muscle tissue, but these actual terms apply to every tissue in the body. They also affect fat cells, too. So we could use the exact same terms for gaining or losing body fat. Instead of fat gain and fat loss, we could say atrophy versus hypertrophy, and those would actually be accurate terms. They would actually be the correct scientific terms for fat gain and fat loss, just like muscle gain and muscle loss. So, understanding the difference here. Catabolism is any tissue in the body losing some of its size or giving up some of its energy. Now, in the case of muscle cells, that usually means tissue proteins, right? In the case of fat cells, that means it's losing fat tissue. In the case of bone, not just cell things happening, but it could be the loss of minerals, demineralization of that actual area around the cell, because those cells are all encased in a substance. So catabolism is any tissue giving up some of its weight of its primary substance that's in it, or giving up energy. Anabolism is the exact opposite. It's the gaining of tissue weight. Or not even gaining the weight, actually, because a weight is a long-term acute effect, something we can measure. It's the giving up of energy or giving up of its substance. So again, for muscles, that means muscles are gaining protein. Fat cells are gaining lipids or fats inside of them. Now, that's the short term, and remember, that's happening in all of these cells all the time. It never stops happening. But what ends up happening in any cell in the body, again, we'll take muscle tissue, the most common one for you guys. If a muscle, over the course of a 24-hour period, or a 7-day period, because that's actually measurable. You can't measure muscle gains in a single day. It's too small to measure even with a microscope, but we can measure it over the course of a week or a month. So if over a course of a week, you have the anabolism, the gaining of tissue proteins in muscles exceeding the catabolism, that muscle grows, and we call that hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is a state to where the gains outweigh the losses over a period of time, and therefore the muscle gets measurably bigger. The muscle fibers themselves get measurably bigger. I mean, obviously muscles get bigger and smaller visually just based on glucose and water, but we're talking about actual real tissue changes, the long-term stuff. And by that same token, what we call atrophy of it, when the catabolism exceeds the anabolism over a period of time. And this gets really interesting when we talk about muscle tissue, because when you think about it, when do you lose the most muscle tissue? What activity do most of you regularly perform that cause the loss of muscle tissue? Because we're going to go somewhere with this. When you lift weights, when you work out, when you exercise, you actually actively engage in losing muscle tissue. There's a lot of myths out there that people think that this is about micro tearing, right? That it's these micro tears happening that are causing you to grow. That's actually not true. The micro tearing is a totally different thing, and that's usually just in the connective tissue around it. So you're not really doing that, but what you are doing is you're disrupting the homeostasis of the muscle. You're making the body work so hard that it strains those muscles, and sometimes it causes them to break down some of their own tissue proteins internally in order to fuel the activity you're going through. It causes them to, give up their glycogen stores, use that for fuel, because that's what the muscle tissue that you're using for weightlifting burns. It burns glucose. It doesn't burn lipids to the same extent that the slower twitch can. But the ones you're really trying to make bigger, they use glucose. So they'll pull glucose out of your bloodstream. They'll pull glycogen out of their own glycogen stores to help them contract. When that starts running slow, once you get a few reps in, they got to start tapping into their own glycogen stores. And sometimes, and hopefully, they even tap into their own tissue proteins sometimes as metabolic fatigue accumulates through a workout or through a set. They pull some of their own protein stores and convert that into glucose. When that happens, they start breaking down. They get smaller, and it's not like you're thinking of you're ripping it apart. No, you're just pulling some of their fuel sources out, includes your own tissue proteins. When that happens, that's an extreme catabolic state. In fact, that elevates stress hormones in the body, that elevates cortisol. And what have we found in studies? That cortisol, which we know cortisol does two things, right? It breaks down amino acids into glucose in cells, and it breaks down lipids in cells to release them into the bloodstream. So it pulls lipids out of fat cells, and it pulls amino acids out of tissue protein, which is generally located in your muscles, to use as fuel. That's what cortisol does. That's why too much cortisol over time can cause you to lose muscle. It's your stress hormone. It can slow your metabolism because of that too. But cortisol gets elevated massively right at the end of a workout. And what we have found is that it isn't the amount of testosterone and HGH that you produce after a workout that affects muscle growth. We found in the meta-analysis it doesn't affect them. But what we have found is that the more cortisol that you spike immediately after a workout is directly correlated with the amount of muscle growth you see in the future later. So what that means is that actual breakdown of tissue protein, that catabolism, triggers an opposite response in the body. So think about that for a minute. The actual catabolic process of lifting weights disrupts the muscle, and your body seeks to create a form of homeostasis. It realizes that what you're doing to that muscle could damage it over time. You're subjecting it to enough stress that it is being forced to lose tissue proteins in order to complete the activity you're doing. Well, what happens if you do that chronically over time? You keep doing that. The body tries to respond by saying, okay, this muscle needs more tissue proteins. Structurally, to survive what he's doing to it, because he's putting so much stress on it that it's having to give this up to move this weight, to move this resistance. And over time, what that does, that catabolic response, your body responds with an even stronger anabolic response to reach homeostasis, to push it back in the other direction. So you tend to regain within the same day any muscle that you lost. And usually that's how it happens at first. But if you chronically do that and you keep lifting weights several times a week, what if you keep lifting weights for a couple weeks straight, several weeks? What your body eventually does is that stress increases. It starts saying, okay, I have to actually go even further the other direction. So it starts taking that catabolic response. As long as you give it enough food and enough rest to do so, enough protein back in your diet, enough sleep, your body will push the other direction. It will start taking that catabolic response that you create and give an even stronger anabolic response in return that will make that muscle bigger. So you actually lose muscle tissue weight, actual proteins in it. You lose hypertrophy every time that you lift weights. Every single time if you train with any degree of intensity or workload. And that loss, your body tries to reach homeostasis and safety in your tissue by making the muscle grow bigger. So actually in this case, the catabolic response of this type causes a larger anabolic response so that you get pushed the other direction. So you lose a lot of muscle, relatively speaking, as far as the amount you could lose in a day. You lose a lot on days you weight lift. your body pushes back the anabolism in the other direction, and in the long term, when the anabolism exceeds the catabolism for the day, you get hypertrophy. The muscle grows over time. So it's an interesting thing to look at. So when you really look at the process of gaining muscle and the hypertrophy here, it's actually quite a complicated process that goes on in the body. And I've really dumbed this down and simplified it into layman's terms, but that's essentially what is happening. You spark muscle loss. You spark your body to break down glycogen and tissue proteins for fuel through the stress that you put on the muscle, and it takes that catabolism and pushes an anabolic response that's even larger over time, just a little bit more than what you broke down. And again, that's how the muscle grows. So understanding the difference between these four things is to remember is that catabolism and anabolism are short-term responses that are actually happening all the time in every cell in your body. All the muscle cells in your body are losing and gaining energy and weight at the same time, simultaneously. And the atrophy and hypertrophy are the long-term balance of the two, of whether it pushes towards more or less. So remember, the atrophy is cells shrinking in the long term due to these two forces at play when they come out of balance. When one wins over the other over time, it either causes atrophy and it shrinks, or hypertrophy and it grows. So hopefully that explains that, and you guys now understand the difference between these four things. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.